You have walked into a room and felt it. The conversation does not stop. It simply redirects. The energy shifts, not toward you, but around you, as if you were furniture someone had already accounted for. You speak, and the response is polite, not engaged. Polite. The kind of acknowledgement people give to things that do not require their full attention. You have felt this more than once, at work, among friends, in your own family. The strange, quiet experience of being present and being invisible at the same time. But here is what Niccolo Machiavelli understood about this phenomenon 500 years ago, and it changes everything you believe about why people ignore you. It has nothing to do with your personality, nothing to do with your confidence, nothing to do with how interesting or intelligent you are. It has to do with value, specifically the kind of value that is impossible to look away from. Machiavelli spent decades inside the courts of Renaissance Florence, not as a nobleman, not as a king, as an observer, a diplomat without wealth, a strategist without an army, a man whose only weapon was his capacity to see what everyone else refused to admit. He watched men with extraordinary talent get ignored. He watched men with mediocre ability command entire rooms. And he documented the difference with a precision so uncomfortable that the Catholic Church banned his work for over 2 centuries. They did not ban it because it was wrong. They banned it because it was accurate. And accuracy, when it reveals the machinery behind human attention, is the most dangerous thing an institution can encounter. What Machiavelli mapped was not politics. It was the architecture of human perception. The invisible rules that determine who gets noticed, who gets remembered, and who gets treated as though they were never in the room at all. He identified patterns, laws, not laws written in any legal code, but laws as binding as gravity, forces that operate whether you believe in them or not, whether you approve of them or not, whether you have ever heard of them or not. 7 of those laws are what this video is about, not as historical curiosities, as operating instructions for a world that will continue to overlook you until you understand why it does. The reason being ignored feels so personal, so specifically targeted, is that you have been taught to believe attention is given to people based on who they are. It is not. Attention is given to people based on what they represent to the perceiver, not who you are in your own experience of yourself, who you are in their calculation of what you provide. This is not a modern insight. Machiavelli wrote it plainly. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you. He was describing the fundamental asymmetry of human perception. People do not experience you. They experience their impression of you. And that impression is built not from your character, your depth, your loyalty, or your goodness. It is built from signals, specific, readable, external signals that your brain broadcasts constantly, whether you are aware of them or not. The man who is ignored is not broadcasting weakness. He is broadcasting something worse. He is broadcasting predictability, availability, the signal that says, I am here, I will always be here, and you do not need to invest any attention to keep me here. That signal is invisible to the man sending it, but it is deafening to the people receiving it. Evolutionary psychology calls this the attention economy. Your brain allocates focus the same way a market allocates capital, toward whatever appears scarce, dynamic, and potentially valuable, away from whatever appears abundant, static, and already secured. You are not being ignored because you lack value. You are being ignored because the way you present your value tells the room it does not need to pay attention to keep it. Machiavelli understood this. Every law that follows is built on this single foundation. Tell me in the comments, when was the first time you realized the room was not ignoring you by accident? When did the pattern become impossible to unsee? Write it below. Naming the moment is already the beginning of dismantling it. Subscribe if you want the full architecture. What comes next is where it gets dangerous. The first law is the one that contradicts everything you have been taught about earning attention. You have been told that showing up consistently, being reliable, being always available is how you build trust and connection. Machiavelli observed the opposite. He wrote about leaders who were most powerful not when they appeared, but when they disappeared. The rooms that talked about them most were the rooms they were absent from. This is the law of withdrawn presence. The principle that your visibility increases not when you add more of yourself to a space, but when you subtract. Think about the person in your life who is hardest to reach. Not rude, not dismissive, simply not always available. When they do appear, the room shifts. When they speak, people listen. Not because what they say is more intelligent than what you say, because their presence carries weight, the weight of scarcity. Now think about yourself. How available are you? How quickly do you respond to every message? How reliably do you appear at every gathering? How consistently do you fill every silence with your willingness to engage? You are not building trust. You are building furniture. You are training the people around you to treat your presence the way they treat oxygen. Essential, invisible, and utterly taken for granted. Machiavelli's observation was surgical. The man who is always present has no entrance. He is simply there. The man who arrives, who enters, commands the room's recalibration. Withdrawal is not absence, it is architecture. It is the deliberate creation of a space that makes your return visible. The second law operates on a different axis entirely. It governs not where you are, but what people can predict about why you are there. Machiavelli wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are." This was not advice about deception. It was an observation about the relationship between predictability and power. The man whose intentions are transparent, whose motivations are obvious, whose reactions are foreseeable, is a man the room has already solved. And solved things do not hold attention. Puzzles do. You have experienced this. The person at work whose motivations you cannot quite read. The friend who is warm but never desperate. The individual who seems genuinely content whether the room includes them or not. That person occupies more of your mental space than the people you fully understand. Not because they are manipulating you. Because your brain is designed to allocate cognitive resources toward unresolved patterns. When someone is unreadable, when their next move is genuinely uncertain, your brain categorizes them as a potential threat or opportunity that requires monitoring. This is not a conscious choice. It is an involuntary neurological response. The man who is ignored has made himself completely legible. His needs are visible. His reactions are predictable. His emotional state is available for anyone to read without effort. He has given the room no reason to keep watching. The correction is not to become dishonest. It is to become selective. To stop narrating your internal state to people who have not earned access to it. To allow silence where you once offered explanation. To let people wonder, not because you're playing a game, but because not everything you think and feel belongs in the public domain. The third law is the one most men understand intellectually and fail to execute entirely. Machiavelli observed that in Florence, the men who were respected were not the men who threatened consequences. They were the men who had demonstrated them. There is a fundamental difference between saying you will withdraw and actually withdrawing, between implying there are limits and showing where the limits are. The man who is ignored has often spent years signaling that there are no consequences for ignoring him. He responds when called upon. He forgives without requiring change. He absorbs disrespect without altering the dynamic. He has taught the room that his attention is free, and free things are never valued. The law of demonstrated consequence states that people calibrate their behavior toward you based on the last consequence they experienced, not the last thing you said. Words set expectations, actions set precedents, and precedents are the only currency the human brain respects when calculating how to treat someone. When someone disrespects your time and you say nothing, that is a demonstrated consequence. It demonstrates that there is no consequence. When someone ignores your contribution and you continue contributing at the same rate, that is a precedent. It establishes that your contribution requires no acknowledgement. Every interaction is a negotiation, and in every negotiation, the party willing to walk away holds the leverage. Not because walking away is desirable, because the willingness to walk away communicates that your presence is not guaranteed, and presence that is not guaranteed must be attended to. The fourth law dismantles the single most destructive pattern among men who feel invisible, the pattern of giving everything, always, to everyone, without discrimination. Machiavelli wrote about generosity with a clarity that disturbed his readers. He observed that the prince who gives freely to all is eventually forced to tax heavily, while the prince who gives selectively, deliberately, with visible intention, is called generous precisely because the gift is rare. This translates directly into your personal relationships. The man who is always helpful, always available, always willing to drop what he is doing to serve someone else's need, that man is not seen as generous. He is seen as default. His giving has no signal value because it has no scarcity. Compare him to the man who helps rarely but meaningfully, who shows up at the critical moment with exactly the right support, whose assistance feels like an event rather than a background hum. The second man is valued. The first is consumed. Strategic generosity is not selfishness. It is the recognition that your capacity to give is a finite resource, and finite resources must be allocated where they generate mutual value, not scattered where they generate invisible consumption. When you give everything to everyone, you are not being kind. You are being legible. You are broadcasting that your resources have no gatekeeper, that access to you requires no effort, that the cost of receiving from you is zero. And the human brain, operating on the same ancient code that evaluates every exchange for its survival value, categorizes zero-cost resources as zero-value resources. Give less. Give deliberately. Give to the people who register the gift. And watch how the room begins to recalibrate. The fifth law governs what you reveal about yourself, and more importantly, when. Machiavelli spent his career watching men destroyed not by their enemies, but by their own disclosures. The diplomat who revealed his strategy before the negotiation, the prince who confessed his fears before the battle, the advisor who shared his doubts before the decision was made. Information, in Machiavelli's framework, is not a tool for connection. It is a form of power. And power, once distributed, cannot be recalled. The man who is ignored often shares too much, too freely, too early. His struggles are public. His ambitions are announced before they are achieved. His emotional landscape is available for anyone to survey without investment. He believes transparency builds intimacy. What it actually builds is a map, a complete, detailed map of his vulnerabilities, his desires, and his pressure points, handed freely to anyone in the room, regardless of whether they have earned the right to hold it. Controlled information is not secrecy. It is discernment. It is the recognition that not every truth about you belongs in every conversation. That your inner world is not a commodity to be distributed. It is a territory to be protected. When you speak less about your plans, people become curious about your direction. When you reveal less about your struggles, people become attentive to your state. When you stop explaining yourself before anyone has asked for an explanation, people begin to wonder. And wondering is the precursor to watching. And watching is the precursor to valuing. The sixth law is the one that separates the man who is ignored from the man who is magnetic. And it has nothing to do with charisma. It has to do with need. Machiavelli observed that the princes who needed the approval of their subjects were perpetually at the mercy of public opinion. The princes who appeared self-contained, who seemed to derive their stability from within rather than from the crowd, were the ones the crowd most desperately wanted to be near. This is the paradox of emotional independence. The less you appear to need the room's validation, the more the room works to provide it. If this reframe is landing for you, if you can feel the architecture of something you have lived but never named, a like puts this in front of someone else who is sitting in that same invisible room right now. The man who is ignored is often the man whose emotional state is visibly dependent on how others treat him. When he is included, he brightens. When he is excluded, he dims. His internal weather is controlled by external conditions, and everyone in the room can see it. That visibility is the problem, not because vulnerability is wrong, but because visible dependence on external validation communicates one thing with absolute clarity. This person's stability is not self-generated, and people do not invest attention in unstable structures. They invest attention in structures that appear solid, not because they are heartless, because their brain is running a calculation older than language. Who in this environment is safe to rely on, and who needs to rely on me? The man who appears to need nothing from the room is the man the room cannot stop watching. His composure is a mystery. His stillness is a signal. His refusal to chase validation is itself the most validating thing he could communicate about his own worth. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means relocating the source of your emotional regulation from external validation to internal standards. It means building a life where your stability is not contingent on whether the room sees you, and then watching the room begin to see you precisely because of that. Subscribe if you want to keep building with this. There is more of this architecture waiting. The room never ignored who you are. It was waiting for you to stop ignoring it yourself. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one. Aim work was not simply power, it was currency. And the man who spends all his currency at once has nothing left to negotiate with. The strategist reveals himself in layers, never completely, never all at once. He understands that mystery is not deception, it is protection. Every time you explain yourself to someone who has not earned the explanation, you give away leverage you will need later. Machiavelli's correspondence reveals a man who shared his full thinking with perhaps 3 people in his entire life. Everyone else received only what they needed to know. This is not cruelty. This is architecture. Raud were the princes most easily manipulated. They changed their convictions with every shift in popular sentiment. But the prince who appeared unmoved, who seemed to operate from an internal compass, became a gravitational center himself. People do not follow need, they follow certainty. The moment you need someone's attention more than they need yours, you have handed them the contract. Machiavelli understood that respect flows toward the man who can walk away, not the man who threatens to walk away, the man who has already accepted internally that he may need to. This is not coldness, this is freedom. The 7th and final law is the one that makes all the others possible. Machiavelli observed that the princes who announced their transformations rarely completed them. The man who declares he is changing invites scrutiny, resistance, and sabotage from those invested in his former self. But the man who transforms silently, who simply begins operating by new principles without announcement or explanation, forces the world to reckon with the result, not the process. You do not need permission to become valuable. You do not need an audience for your evolution. You need only the discipline to execute these laws consistently until the room has no choice but to notice. Machiavelli became dangerous not because he spoke loudly, but because he understood deeply. And that understanding, applied quietly, restructured the world around him. If this framework shifted something in you, subscribe. There is a library of this waiting. And in the comments, tell me which of these 7 laws you are implementing first. I read every single one. Thank you for your attention. I will see you in the next one.